All right, this is Josh T. Franco interviewing Gabo Camnitzer at his home in Brooklyn, New York on August 7th, 2020 for the Smithsonian Institution Archives of American Art Pandemic Project. Gabo, thanks for taking a few minutes to talk to us, to talk to me for the archives. And this project, really is just about checking in on American artists in 2020, the year of pandemics of COVID-19, surging racism, and we want to see how people are. So how have you been since March?
Relatively speaking, pretty well, I have to say. I mean, all things considered, I count myself among the lucky ones, I'd say. Yeah, but it's hard to sort of act like nothing horrible is happening in the world on a daily basis.
Yeah, well, you've been particularly active around one of the kind of effects of all this, which is rent, and the kind of, I'll say it in hashtag form, hashtag cancel rent, but it's a large movement. Has been very visible and important component of things. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, really the housing crisis in New York and in the country, precedes COVID. I mean, I think it's really just a matter of that when COVID kicked into gear, it really exacerbated all the problems that were already happening. And during that time, like early March, I started making graphics for the Housing Justice for All Coalition, which is this great coalition of New York-based organizations all over the state that have been working with these questions of housing rights for years, really. So I started making graphics just like for Instagram and stuff, and I was getting more engaged with that. And then me and my partner reached out to people in our building. We live in a building with like over 100 units. Actually, first, it was really just to see if there was need for mutual aid. You know, there are a lot of mutual aid networks popping up at that time. We'd only lived here less than a year, so we didn't really know people in the building that well. So we just first we put up posters. They got taken down by management. So then we flyered the building, and we got a decent response. So it started out just like seeing if people needed help. If there were people who were sick or elderly, and then it sort of transitioned into basically a rent strike. Because at first we wanted to see if management would offer rent relief. I mean, I think the same thing played out on a massive scale all across the city, all across the country, where it's just like trying to see if there's going to be any kind of like meeting halfway with management. And for the most part, I mean, there are of course exceptions, but for the most part, landlords and management companies have just like refused to negotiate with tenants. So it steadily escalated into a rent strike, which, kind of at every turn, we had the management kind of, sorry, someone's screwing something in. We had management kind of just making the situation worse for everyone, but that would mobilize tenants further. So, but I mean, now we have the situation where the housing courts are about to open in New York. Or I mean, Andrew Cuomo, the governor, keeps extending the moratorium month by month. But so everyone's just like on tenterhooks. And I mean, just thinking about how the crisis precedes COVID, like while the moratorium applies to people who have been affected by COVID, people prior to COVID that have been like served eviction notices are now already in court, because the moratorium doesn't apply to them. So, I mean, there's 14,000 families in New York families who have been served eviction notices just from like January, February, and beginning of March. So, I mean, it's just, and like thinking about how that, I mean, everything's all connected. So like those families who will be without housing, like are more susceptible to all the other issues of this moment, So, yeah, I mean, we could talk about that the whole time. It wouldn't be enough, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I think just one, it's important takeaway is just that, your contributions with your artistic skills to the visual, amplification of Cancel Rent was noticed, and important. And yeah, the cliff is here. We'll see what happens. But so one thing I want to be sure to ask you about too is education in this context, in the COVID 2020 context, and for two big, significant, different reasons. One, your college level teaching, which I'll get to, but also you as an artist, your practice is really you collaborate with children and you invite them into works, and they are your partners in a lot of your significant artworks. Can you describe one or two of those exciting projects? And then I'm curious if that experience has given you a lens on what back to school is meaning for people right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as an example, a project that I was working on prior to COVID, was just like working with an after school program in New York on the Lower East Side, 6th Street Community Center. And it's just like involved me going in most Fridays and collaborating with kids on this project around like children's movements and children's forms of protest throughout history, and thinking about like the current climate strikes around the world, and how while they're really fantastic, they all tend to fall into certain traps of sort of organized demonstration that can like limit their impact. And just like thinking together with children about how children in the past have found more militant and more sort of subversive ways of mobilizing in relation to like labor rights and things like that, school student rights and so forth. And that, way of working, that kind of long-term engagement, face-to-face, like in a room, building relationships and movement building more broadly, I think is facing a crisis. But so I'm sort of in this period of trying to rethink how those forms of being together can exist during a moment like this, and that's like an ongoing sort of struggle to figure out. I think like this paradox that we're all like inhabiting, thinking about or being forced to choose like whether we're going to prioritize the health of students and teachers, of children and teachers, versus like the economy. I think really it's a false kind of setup. I mean, the bigger question is like educational inequity, how little money is invested in the education system, public education system. So really like in New York, which is the only major school district in the country that's planning to be in person in less than a month, which is crazy. Like basically these super sort of underserved schools are being forced to create contingency plans that really put everyone at risk. And when they kick up the fuss, it's the teachers and the administrators that are being blamed, rather than, the neoliberal system, the austerity system that's sort of deprived them of the actual tools to do this in any kind of safe way. So all that is to say that like both in relation to like my work, my artistic production, and like just being a parent, thinking about like having a kid in the education system, like it's really just trying to grapple with these larger structural inequalities and trying to engage with them in a way that's like not just firefighting, not just dealing with it one day at a time, but like actually meaningfully trying to change the whole system. And going forward, like I'm even more invested in that than that's something I always felt invested in, but like now I feel like I really feel like I have less interest in those short-term projects that kind of just like are ameliorative, but not necessarily long-term, you know, or not necessarily thinking about structural change. So yeah, going forward, I hope to focus more and more on that sort of long-term structural sort of change.
Yeah, that's an interesting shift to watch some artists make from project-based works to long-term life goals. But I do wonder about this particular, have you experimented with or have any thoughts to play with Zoom, like this kind of technology with children, or are you just sort of waiting this out to get back to that kind of work?
Yeah, I think I'm, to an extent at this point, I think I'm waiting it out. I have a really sort of complicated relationship with Zoom, I think, or like just with telecommunications more generally. So like, I think like I'm like seriously suspicious of it as a technology. At the same time, like I acknowledge question, like the ways that it addresses certain problems around accessibility and those things. But I'm, to an extent, hopeful that like the importance of that face-to-face encounter, the importance of like being in a room together, working together, touching the same objects, like making things together, can stay privileged, you know, can stay like a sacred space. And I think the time scale that we have of like hopefully having a vaccine by February, or I mean early 2021, puts a, like an end date on this in a way that I feel like capable of waiting it out, you know. Now on the flip side of that, like I am working in higher ed, and like right now I'm like trying to develop a curriculum that can function within these like strange modalities in a way that's generative. But even in that capacity, like I'm going to be teaching at UMass Dartmouth, and like we're developing a curriculum that will be like outdoors as much as possible. You know, it's like a very beautiful, vast campus that has like a lot of nature. So we're just developing, you know, projects that will engage the nature. So yeah, I'm with full awareness that in 20 years, people might like look back on this and think like, oh, that was before we took, you know, Zoom remote learning for granted, and that like my position might be dated. But I'm still kind of very attached to the need to be like working with people in a room, and like, you know, with people that belong to your immediate community, like your physical material community.
Yeah.
Because I think that's like going back to those structural questions, like it's on that level that we can make change happen. I think it's a lot more difficult when we're sort of abstracted from one another and alienated from one another, and our interactions are mediated through, you know, big tech companies.
Yeah. Yes, that's worth thinking about. So yeah, this new position at UMass Dartmouth, I want to hear more about what it is, but going back a little bit, you were teaching at Columbia the last few years. Can you talk a bit about how it was to be so just abruptly disrupted mid-spring semester by COVID, and what that was like?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it was nuts. I mean, what can I say? I think like anyone working at any level of education experienced a very abrupt, somewhat traumatic experience, because like, you know, you spend this time building these relationships, and then suddenly like certain elements of those relationships are laid bare in a very sort of destabilizing way. You know, just like thinking about, particularly like working in a private institution, just like that the consumer relationship that the students have justifiably to their education. And then suddenly I'm on this other side of the divide in terms of just like ostensibly providing a service, you know, and just like being aware that, I mean, particularly just going back to my stance on, you know, remote teaching, like I'm in my own eyes providing something that I feel like isn't a sufficient substitution to what we would have been having otherwise if we were in person. So, I mean, I think like basically I had like syllabi for the classes I was teaching that was like, I spent time developing, years developing really, that I was happy with, and suddenly I had to tear them up and really try to develop something that functioned within the parameters of remote learning in a way that felt generative. And there are certain aspects that worked really well and certain aspects that, didn't work at all, so it was really a learning experience. I think like now with the benefit of hindsight, like I can just like really sort of expand on the things that were working and really not try to develop things that like won't work, and I think that's partially why at UMass Dartmouth, like we're going to be really sort of leaning in to the novelty of the situation and really just like focusing on, working in the nature there and being outdoors as much as possible, and really sort of making provisional site specific works that engage with like questions of land use and, working with questions of sustainability and ethical like use of the land. I think like it'll be something very specific to the moment, but it'll be also something that, hopefully will serve the students and the people teaching for the rest of their lives,
Yeah. I mean, that's such a great resource in that area of the country to have
Totally.
at this time. Have you, we just always want to know too about people's access to their studios, if those are separate from their homes. Did COVID disrupt access to them? So where do you work, and is that still possible?
Yeah, so my studio is in Maspeth. I'm in Bushwick, Brooklyn, and my studio's in Maspeth, Queens. It's like 20-minute walk.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say like, yeah, that physical divide, while it's very sort of manageable, the sort of epistemological and emotional one is like far more difficult to cross. I think like, yeah, I've only been there a handful of times, and it's usually like for logistical purposes rather than going to like work open-endedly. That said, I have been doing some work at home. But yeah, I feel like, yeah, this period has really shaken me to the core in terms of just thinking about like what the purpose of artistic production is in a moment like this, and like what my role as an artist is. And I guess I would say I've always had an ambivalent relationship to the studio in terms of just like it being a space where I work in isolation on something that I want to do. I've been more, particularly over the past like 10 years or so, more focused on collaborative projects and sort of just open-ended prompts that I then explore with people. So I'd say like certain hesitations or reservations I've had about like the studio as a model of production like have been enhanced. I'm sure I'll come back to it at a certain point, but just like the privilege involved in having a separate space, while I continue to pay for it, that privilege of having that space is something I'm uncomfortable with, particularly like given people's relationships to housing at this moment in this city.
Oh yeah, I had not thought about that in relationship to the housing anxieties people are having. That's interesting.
Yeah.
In the last couple minutes here, so with the archives, we reasonably expect to be around as part of the Smithsonian. So for that researcher in 100 years, I like to think of them as practicing artists, but the researcher, what should they know about what it was like to be an artist in 2020?
Well, first, I'm very happy that there are researchers and artists in 100 years. That's great news. Yeah, I mean, I guess like hopefully looking back at this moment or this whole like epoch, this whole era, will seem quaint in our inability to inhabit contradiction. And hopefully in 100 years, like the lessons of simplistic understandings of society will have been learned. I think like, yeah, I mean, really just going back to what I was talking about in terms of relationship to my studio and relationship to the artistic production at this moment, it's really just like that feeling of like inhabiting contradictions that I can't reconcile, I can't like make sense of, you know? And I feel like more generally education during this period of time, I mean, it's probably 2000 years or more at this point, has been like woefully inept at preparing people for inhabiting contradiction, for really understanding the contradictions that we embody. So I hope like that's something that feels dated and quaint in 100 years.
I like that. Thanks, Gabo.
Thank you.